During the Cold War, America developed a single air-to-air nuke that could devastate entire fleets of bombers in midair. Thankfully, it was only ever actually fired in testing. In today's world, nuclear weapons are seen primarily as strategic weapons rather than as tactical ones, and that the second and third order effects of a nuclear detonation can sometimes be even further reaching than the explosion itself. Even the use of a low-yield nuclear weapon is now seen as perhaps among the most egregious violations of international norms that a nation can undertake, as leveraging just a single nuke could bring about a cascade of nuclear attacks that could literally end life as we know it. But it wasn't always this way. There was a time when nuclear weapons were held in a similar regard to any other conventional ordnance, when the tactical applications of nuclear weapon systems were the primary consideration in their development. Long before the concept of mutually assured destruction, the United States and its Soviet competitors established a variety of nuclear weapons that, in hindsight, seem more like the musings of a Bond villain than any real defense program. Some of these weapons, like the B-54 Special Atomic Demolition Munition, were little more than miniaturized nuclear bombs that could be smuggled into a target zone via special operations troops in a literal backpack. Others, like the McDonnell Douglas Air-2A Genie rocket, were designed for even more dramatic uses, namely, destroying an entire fleet of Soviet bombers with a single launch. In 1949, the Soviet Union conducted its first successful atomic weapons test. The 22-kiloton bomb was more powerful than the 15-kiloton weapon the US had used on Hiroshima just a few years prior, and in an instant, America's concerns about the Soviet Union were amplified significantly. Almost immediately, President Truman announced the development of a new and even more powerful atom bomb, a super bomb as he called it, but now we know it as a hydrogen bomb. Of course, Soviet efforts to develop their own super bomb mirrored America's, raising the stakes once again for this burgeoning Cold War. With the first operational intercontinental ballistic missiles still literally years away, the understanding at the time was that any hydrogen bomb attack would have to come by way of heavy bomber, with development already underway for what would become the Soviet Tu-95. This new heavy payload bomber was designed by literally upscaling the previous Soviet Tu-4, which had been based largely on America's own B-29 Superfortress, widely considered to be the most advanced bomber of World War II. Aware that the Soviet Union's atomic arsenal could eventually be brought to bear with heavy payload bombers, prompted the United States to invest heavily in aircraft and weapon systems that could intercept these bombers well before they could reach American shores. The driving need to monitor, deter, and potentially intercept Soviet nuclear bombers led to the development of a number of weapons and aircraft, but few were quite as far-reaching as the McDonnell Douglas Air-2A Genie program. The US Air Force had its sights set squarely on neutering the Soviet Union's nuclear bomber threat, but the vast majority of air-to-air weapon systems at the time were based on machine guns and cannons. America knew that stopping a fleet of Soviet bombers before they could reach the US would require far more effective weapon systems than were readily available at the time, and the first air-to-air missiles were still in their relative infancy. As a result, rockets became an area of increasing focus. In 1954, one such rocket program, under the banner of Douglas Aircraft, began playing with the idea of a rocket that was armed with a nuclear warhead. In theory, at least, the premise was pretty straightforward. Rockets had already proven to be an effective weapon for intercept aircraft to leverage, and in fact, a nuclear-tipped air-to-air weapon could be developed pretty simply, because the massive blast radius would really eliminate the need for any kind of real guidance system. By 1955, development was officially underway on what would come to be called the McDonnell Douglas Air-2A Genie. This new nuclear rocket carried a 1.5 kiloton W-25 nuclear warhead and was propelled through the air by a solid fuel rocket engine. The engine would fire for just 2 seconds, but that was enough to propel it up to Mach 3.3. The fuse mechanism didn't begin until the engine itself had burned all the way out, and that gave the weapon a total of about 12 seconds of flight time, which was just enough for the launching aircraft to get the hell out of Dodge before a 1,000-foot fireball erupted from the warhead. Because of the Genie's short flight time and absolutely massive blast radius, it would be nearly impossible for a bomber to get out of the way fast enough to avoid utter destruction, and in fact, a single Genie could be used to engage and destroy an entire formation of Soviet bombers that were approaching the United States. Serial production of the Genie, which was dubbed the MB-1 Genie in service, continued until 1963, with a total of around 3,150 of these rockets built. A fleet of 268 U.S. Air Force F-89 Scorpion interceptors were each modified to be able to carry this nuclear rocket on hardpoints, and over time, the weapons were even modified to include longer-burning rocket engines that would give the F-89 a little bit more time to escape the fury of the rocket's detonation. Although the Genie would remain in service until the decidedly recent past of 1985, only one Genie was ever actually fired and detonated. Operation Plumbob, and yeah, that's really what they called it, was a series of nuclear tests conducted on the Nevada test site between May 28th and October 7th of 1957. It would go on to be considered by many to be the most controversial series of nuclear tests ever conducted by the United States. A total of 27 nuclear detonations and 29 total explosions were carried out under the supervision of 21 different laboratories and government agencies. One of those controversial tests was a test fire and detonation of none other than a Genie nuclear rocket. Firing a live Genie from beneath an F-89J was a dangerous undertaking to begin with. In order to escape the blast radius of the weapon, the F-89's pilot, Captain Eric William Hutchinson, would have to immediately execute a high G turn, placing the rocket behind the aircraft. While Hutchinson and his radar operator, Captain Alfred Barbie, both needed nerves of steel to complete the test, they weren't the only people putting their lives on the line for this Genie's only ever test detonation. 5 U.S. Air Force officers also volunteered to stand at ground level, directly beneath where the nuclear weapon would detonate in the sky, all just to prove that the Genie could be utilized without causing any harm to troops on the ground below. Estimates of the altitude in which the Genie detonated vary from source to source, with some claiming an altitude as low as 10,000 feet and others claiming one as high as 20,000. The 5 volunteer officers stood below utterly unprotected, wearing literally only their summer uniforms. George Yashitaki, a U.S. Army cameraman who was present for the test, said, and I quote, "I was busy behind the camera. Then I could see the flash go off out of the corner of my eye. There was this huge donut-shaped cloud in the sky where the blast went off." And as luck, or maybe science, would have it, those 5 men were exposed to just negligible amounts of radiation, and they really did seem to prove that the Genie could be used in the sky above ground troops who were operating in battle. As I mentioned earlier, the Genie nuclear rocket stayed in service all the way until the mid-1980s, but by then, American concerns about Soviet bombers dropping hydrogen bombs on American soil had really given way to the ICBM age. By 1974, the Soviet Union had their R-36 series of nuclear missiles in service. Each of these missiles could cover nearly 10,000 miles and carry an absolutely massive 25 megaton, or 25,000 kiloton, nuclear weapon. In truth, it wasn't necessarily the ICBM so much as the concept of mutually assured destruction that would really come to replace the Air-2A Genie as a nuclear deterrent. America now knew they really had no hope of intercepting the full breadth of Soviet nuclear missiles as they careened towards the United States, so the nation opted to leverage a good offense as the best form of defense, developing America's nuclear triad to ensure its ability to respond. In other words, mutually assured destruction promised exactly what the name suggests. If the Soviets ever did launch a nuclear attack, America would as well. There would be no winners in such an apocalyptic exchange, and that alone has served as a powerful deterrent for nuclear aggression ever since. And that'll do it for this week's edition of Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure you swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got something out of today's video, make sure you click like and subscribe down below. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.